today is called Broward Boulevard in Fort Lauderdale. It appears that that was where the freeze absolutely ended, and from there, the temperatures were then going up. So, think about it. Mr. Ingram, who was Mr. Flagler's land commissioner, is assigned by Mr. Flagler, I want you to make arrangements for us to get land. Now remember, all this land in the Miami area is great. So what does Mr. Ingram do? He goes to the state of Florida, to the Internal Improvement Fund, and says, you know, we're prepared to extend our railroad, but we would like now to be given the donations of land that are part of what the IIF, the Internal Improvement Fund, does. And they said, oh my God, we'll be delighted to. And so a good bit of the land south of West Palm Beach was donated by the state. Alternate sections on each side of the railroad. How big is a section? 640 acres. That's some nice pieces of land. But wait a minute. There were other pieces of land that the Internal Improvement Fund didn't own. The county owned them, or individual landowners. And Mr. Ingram went to each of them. Each of them was willing, said, yes, yes. Several of them said, but I'll give you land, but you have to build a station here. Mr. Ingram said, of course, we'll be happy to. Of course, they didn't stop any trains there, but they built a station. And so, ladies and gentlemen, as I explained to my wonderful history students at Barry University, you need to also understand that the two most important years in Dade County history, in Miami history, were 1896 and 1926. Why 1896? Because in 1896, the first permanent Jewish settler, Isidore Cohen, arrived on the shores of Biscayne Bay, February 6, 1896. April 15, 1896, the first train, not a passenger train, the first train, a construction engineer's train, arrived in what would become Miami. On April 22nd, the first passenger train arrived. On May 11th, the first excursion train from the north arrived. On May 15th, the first edition of the first newspaper in Miami, the Miami Metropolis, was published. And then on July 28th, 1896, Miami, without ever having been a village or a town or incorporated area of any kind, sprang into existence as a city. And on December 31st, 1896, not in 1897, which some people have tried to, no, it wasn't. It was December 31st, 1896, the great and fabled Royal Palm Hotel on the banks of the Miami River, Mr. Flagler's great hotel, opened for business. And so 1896, this terribly important year. But the irony, neither Julia Tuttle nor William Brickell were allowed to vote because they were women. And this was terrible, but that is the way it was at the time, for better or for worse. Now, all this is happening, and we have at the same time the great influence of women coming into Miami and being in Miami. And ladies and gentlemen, some of the great names. Remember the Bahamian influence in today's Coconut Grove, Dr. Stirrup, and in Miami itself, the great D.A. Dorsey. And as I explained to my students, the horror of what happened in South Africa with apartheid. You know, we had slavery, and after slavery we had Jim Crow. Horrible. And yet there were certain things that African Americans, black people, could do even under those terrible conditions, and one of them was to buy land. And Dr. Stirrup, Mr. Dorsey, bought land. And Mr. Dorsey became Miami's first black African American millionaire. But it began with things such as this. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we know there's a place today which we call Overtown. But Overtown did not begin as Overtown. Believe it or not, and it's a terrible thing, we would never say it today. I want everybody to understand that. And yet, at that time, what today is called Overtown was called Darky Town. And in this picture, we see two men and two women. And the women were incredibly important to the very early black African-American Bahamian communities here in what became Miami-Dade County. So it went from being darky town to colored town and then to Overtown. And the influence of the great women who participated in the growth can never, 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 ever be underestimated. Well, what happened from the arrival of the railroad after that? Sadly, in 1898, Julia Tuttle died of influenza. I mean, it's ironic because this great woman never lived to see what she and Mary Brickell had brought. And again now, let's go back. You've heard the orange blossom story, that fable, that fairy tale, as we would say in French, that bouboumaisie, that falderall, which is completely false. Okay, Seth, then why did Mr. Flagler? For land. Remember, he got land north of the Miami River, land south of the Miami River. Thousands and thousands of acres between West Palm Beach and Miami were given, not to him personally, to the railroad. Ladies and gentlemen, doesn't that make a little bit more sense to realize that the reason Mr. Flagler extended the railroad was because he got land, not because some woman sent him some orange blossoms. And that fable needs to be discarded at this point. Not because we're revisionist historians, but because we brought the history up to date with truth. So what happens after that? In 1870, a father and son, Henry and Charles Lum, sailboated north from Key West. It was getting dark, they needed to stay somewhere, and they came onto this mangrove sandbar island, which was off the mainland coast. And they went back to Key West the next day. They had fallen in love with this mangrove sandbar island. They find out it's owned by the state of Florida Internal Improvement Fund, and they are able to buy it for, are we ready? 35 cents an acre. They do not come back for 12 years, but when they come back with fellow New Jerseyites, Ezra Osborne and Elnathan T. Field, they, Field and Osborne, want to put in a coconut plantation. So Field and Osborne buy this mangrove sandbar island from the Lums, who had paid 35 cents an acre for it. The Lums were thrilled. They more than doubled their money. They got 75 cents an acre for it. Field and Osborne were no dummies, though. They bought from the Internal Improvement Fund everything, seriously everything, from Key Biscayne to Jupiter, the entire strip, other than what they paid the Lums 75 cents an acre for $1.25 an acre. Why did they want that? Because they were going to put in a coconut plantation, which they did. Well, the coconut plantation failed. We don't have to give you a history of Miami Beach, but suffice to say that the men who bought it were John S. Collins and Thomas Pancoast. Now, I want you to recognize that these great names, Collins and Pancoast, would eventually become the triumvirate with a fellow by the name of Carl Fisher. And you know, there was a story going around in Miami Beach that a certain person by the name of Rose, I don't have to go any further, was the mother of Miami Beach. No, she wasn't. Now, I'm not talking about the great Rose Weiss. Keep in mind that Joe and Jenny, and I said Rose Weiss, it wasn't Rose Weiss, Jenny. Joe and Jenny Weiss came to Miami in 1906. He had asthma, and it was terrible in New York. And they came down with their son Jesse. And he wasn't getting any relief on the Miami side. And one day he takes the Biscayne Navigation Company ferry over to what was by then called Ocean Beach. He had relief. And he decides that he's going to go see Avery Smith and Jim Moore, who owned Smith's Casino. Now, it wasn't a gambling casino, it was a bathing casino. And he goes over with Jenny and he says to them, look, I will bring you business. I'm a great cook. And Jenny is a wonderful waitress and hostess. It will be great. And if there's a mother of Miami Beach, and the name I gave you, I probably shouldn't have used the last name, but listen, it doesn't matter at this point, right? Somebody claiming that Rose Weiss was the mother. No, she wasn't. Well, she went to every council meeting from the time she got here. Yeah, but so did other people. That didn't make her the mother of Miami Beach. If anybody was the mother of Miami Beach, it had to be the three women. It had to be Jenny, the four women, Jenny Weiss. It had to be the wives of Collins, Pancoast, and Carl Fisher. Those were the mothers of Miami Beach. So we want to make that clear. Now, what's important is that well before the later books would come out, well before, Jane Fisher, Carl Fisher's wife, wrote this wonderful book, Fabulous Hoosier. And she wrote it, yes, about her husband Carl and his life. But she also made clear what she had done. She had been totally supportive, and many of the thoughts and the ideas were hers. And so the role of women in Dade County just expands and expands. And what we then come to find out is that two women were massively important in founding cities besides Miami. And before I get into Miami Shores, I want to mention that a fellow by the name of Glenn Curtis had made some kind of a deal with James Bright. James Bright is the greatest name in Hialeah history, as is Glenn Curtis. Glenn Curtis, the great and famous aviator. And Glenn Curtis came down, had heard about the great boom in South Florida, but he did not buy land on the shoreline or in Miami. He went west, and he was able to make a deal with James Bright. He got into it. It became the Curtis Bright Ranch. At the time, the Curtis Bright Ranch was the largest dairy farm in the state of Florida. And eventually, Mr. Bright had built the city of Hialeah. Glenn Curtis was a partner, but he went across the canal and he started something called Country Club Estates. We know that today as Miami Springs. But then he had another idea. He wanted to build an entirely new and unique city. And what did Glenn Curtis do? He held a national contest to determine the name of the city and the theme. And he had entries, and then one day his mother said, Glenn dear, I don't like any of this. I think we should have an Arabian Nights theme. And I'll give you names of streets and thoughts. And ladies and gentlemen, they took the Indian word seriously. Opatisha Waka Laka. And Glenn Curtis, because of his mother, founded the city of Opa-locka. And all credit goes to Mrs. Curtis. Now, let's come back to the east side. I'm not going to say that Glenn Curtis's mother necessarily founded Opa-locka, but she was a great impetus in the name and the idea, the concept. But we're going to look at, in this book, Boulevard of Dreams, a pictorial history of El Portal, Biscayne Park, Miami Shores, and North Miami. And we're going to really come to the realization that while Julia Tuttle and Mary Brickell founded Miami, along with Henry Flagler and other people, what today is called Miami Shores was founded by a woman. And that woman, with her cousin from Tennessee, Hugh Anderson, had bought the old Collins Bridge, the wooden Collins Bridge, that connected, the first bridge to connect Miami Beach with Miami. Miami Beach at the time, Ocean Beach, and bought the bridge and changed the name to Venetian Causeway and built the various islands on Venetian Causeway. And when they got finished with that, they determined that there was a great opportunity